Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our keynote speeches by Boyana Stage and Nicholas Rowe. I'm delighted to introduce Boyana to you. She was a teacher of mine, and I'm very pleased that she's able to join us. She's a performance theorist and performance maker based in Brussels, a co-founding member of TKH Editorial Collective. She received her PhD in philosophy from the Center for Research in Modern and European Philosophy in London, and MA and BA degrees in musicology and aesthetics from the Faculty of Music, University of the Arts, Belgrade. Her latest books are Choreographing Problems, Expressive Concepts in European Contemporary Dance and Performance, and the series of Choreographers Score, co-written with choreographer Anna-Therese Kirstenmacher about working processes of Rosa's company. She's been co-author, dramaturge, or performer in many dance and theater performances since 1996, with, among others, Jan Ritsema, Xavier Leroy, Esther Salomon, and Mette Ingvardsson. She has directed 5 experimental opera stagings, most notably Don Giovanni at BITEF Belgrade, 2008, with latest works as videos, including In a Non-Wimpy Way, about Steve Paxton, Yvonne Rayner's War, in collaboration with Leonard Leverins for the exhibition Dance Guerre at CCN Rennes, which she co-curated with Cosmin Kostinas in 2013, and Spatial Confessions at Tate Modern in 2014. The program she curated and made choreography, conference, and performance for in collaboration with Christine de Schmet, among others. Boyana teaches at various dance and performance programs in Europe, including Performing Arts Research and Training Studios in Brussels, where she taught me, and has been recently appointed as Professor of Philosophy of Art for Doctoral Studies at Faculty for Media and Communication, University Singintinom in Belgrade. Her current research focuses on social choreography, technologies and performances of the self, and time and rhythm in performance poetics, and post-Fordist modes of production. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome her this morning, Boyana.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming so early to this first session, to this grand hotel. Thank you for having me here. It's a great honor to present my work in this context among so many excellent dance scholars. I will immediately start reading my text because we don't have that much time. I just need to You hear me? Well, is it good like this? In 2012, I was invited by the Dancing Museum in Rennes to stage an exhibition starting from the portmanteau word dance war. My response was to investigate the presence of war in Euro-American stage dance since the World War II, and it was striking how few works took war as their problem or even as their topic. Those that did all opposed war, and curiously, they often resorted to media other than dance, such as film, images, or words, rather than allowing war to problematize their choreographic apparatus. Over the course of this project, I explored the aesthetic figures in the Euro-American dance in which conflict is displaced, repressed, or dissolved, which I understood as symptoms of what Frederick Jameson termed a political unconscious. Not that the choreographers or dancers were unconscious of war, but still the dances they made or presented in proximity to war revealed the difficulty or impossibility of addressing it directly. My research included heterogeneous figures such as the liberal individualist aesthetics of expression instrumentalized in the Cold War cultural diplomacy, the immunization of pacifist ideologies of experimental dance movements in the 70s, and the collapse of social choreography in pre-Balkan War Yugoslavia. In the exhibition display, the aesthetic figures were staged through documents, essays, drawings, videos, and installations made by several artists and dance researchers. So, what remains from earlier project is the question I will pick up here. Why have Western dance and war been at odds? As a tentative explanation, I'm working with the hypothesis that harmony has been acting as a regulative idea in Western dance. The fundamental role of harmony in choreography affects how conflict can be represented or performed. So I'll stick to the post-70s period in which harmony operates as a regulatory idea in two distinct registers, that of choreography on the one hand, and that of the dancing body on the other. The way the word choreography is used figuratively outside of stage dance often indexes a harmonious self-regulating structure. One speaks of, quote, choreography of chromosomes, of an algorithm and workflow, of a security operation. The term denotes an arrangement of patterns in a seamless flow, or a composition in a technical sense. Harmony emanates from various organizational procedures or arrangements such as alignment, forms of trajectory, shapes and movements of the body, rhythms, and synchronization. It's also implicated in the order of tasks, rule games, or scores. In Andrew Hewitt's concept of social choreography, harmony appears in the aesthetic qua-social ideal of cooperation, a harmonious arrangement of individuals performing the social whole. Even when we are talking about choreographies of resistance, we are talking about an arrangement and an ordering of movements of protest. What I'm trying to get at with this word harmony is the fact that even when a choreography deals with conflict, it composes and it negotiates arrangement. In the register of the dancing body, harmony has been even more explicitly opposed to conflict. A good example of the political unconscious I was talking about would be the emergence of contact improvisation at the end of the Vietnam War. It's well known that Aikido was an important cue for contact. The spiritual awakening of Morihei Ueshiba, the founder of Aikido, became Paxton's maxim, and I'm just reminding you obviously here. Quote, to smash, injure, or destroy is the worst thing a human being can do. The real way of a warrior is to prevent such slaughter. It's the art of peace, the power of love. In an interview I conducted as part of this broader investigation, Paxton rephrased this maxim, quote, you were responding with harmony to violence, unbelievable, end of quote. 20 years later, Gaga endows the body with a different sense of harmony. The Gaga movement is fluid and intense, the Gaga dancer having unleashed a child and an animal inside them. In the words of Ocher Naharin, its founder, the Gaga dancer is a, quote, bodybuilder with a soft spine, end of quote. Gaga people are not just ready to coordinate with the forces that be, but available for endless possibilities, quote, constantly yielding while ready to snap if required, end of quote. Naharin famously rebuked the notion that Gaga is another name for a demilitarized body, just as he rejected any interpretation of his invention in light of its Israeli context. We could, at any rate, draw another analogy between the kind of flexible plastic body produced by Gaga worldwide, and Gaga would be just one such technique, and the requirements of a late capitalist society, but that at the same time the ability to find harmony and balance seems to offer a kind of individualized somatic antidote to the shocks of late capitalist labor conditions. Harmony in the somatic register is even more explicitly opposed to conflict than in the choreographic register. Here it promises a sense of balance and absence of conflict and anxiety instilled within the body of the individual. While well-being is often the spiritual or therapeutic rationale of somatic approaches in the commercial key, the main interest to entertain a holistic sense of being a body in tune with itself is to heal and protect the body from injury, which explains why some kinds of body work have originated from the rehabilitation of trauma and of the wounded in war. What these body techniques have achieved is to implant the corporeal agency in the individual, liberating them from aggressive feelings and other negative affects that would inspire belligerence or desires to possess, dispossess, or crush the other. Instead of choreography, improvisation is required in order to peacefully coordinate with the powers that be. Initially, I wish to elaborate the idea of harmony with a prefix that now seems too contentious, risking banality. Nevertheless, I'll try. I will bite my tongue and say it. This harmony is white because it whitewashes its materials. White harmony is overdetermined. First of all, it's a gesture of inclusion that remains in denial about violence and exploitation, as if conflict were just a matter of difference. But second, whiteness or blankness is the result of specifically modernist procedures of harmony, such as purification, immunization, and neutralization. Taking the stance of not knowing and starting from scratch enables sometimes the choreographer to white out nuances and whitewash narrative contexts. As a regulatory idea of choreography and somatic practice, harmony is one factor that puts dance at odds with war. But there's another. Since the 70s, war in the most of the West has been elsewhere, and increasingly so. This creates a peculiar investment of the representational apparatus of the stage, which it divides between a formal here and a represented war. The Giga Vertov group, spearheaded by Jean-Luc Godard, posed the same problem for television in their TV film Here and Elsewhere. Godard and his collaborators shot footage in Palestine for a PLO propaganda movie in 1970, but they abandoned the project before finishing it, and instead combined the footage of the Palestine fighters with the image of a white working-class family in Paris in front of their television set. The Here and the Elsewhere are embedded in a film essay that interrogates binary relations in the war, but also capitalism and the cinematography's apparatus. Out of many questions this film poses, one question will be pertinent for dance that points to the war taking place elsewhere. How to find one's own image in the order of the other? The answer is in the dialectical synthesis, apostrophized with the word "and." This is a still from the film. The filmmaker's task is to construct the in-between of two images, the montage of here and elsewhere, which is also about the synthesis of two disjunctive times and places, that of shooting the film and that of its projection. To think a representational apparatus that is divided in this way is to think the here and the elsewhere. This "and" is one of the problems that await choreography when it attempts to deal with war today. For dance, it also means questioning the exclusivity of the presence here and now in relation to an elsewhere. So to sum up this trajectory, my research into the political unconscious of war in dance allowed me to formulate a few of the reasons that make war so difficult for post-70s dance and choreography to address in the West. But these reasons are in fact very fundamental structures of Euro-American theater dance in this period. Harmony, I've suggested, underlies choreography as arrangement, and it is just as fundamental to somatics. That means that if choreography or dance really wants to take war as a problem, it will always be forced to problematize choreography or dance itself. This is what I'm going to look at now by analyzing two works of dance that make war their problem. Our question then is in part the same as in the investigations I've quickly summarized earlier. How has Euro-American stage dance attempted to address specific political conflicts? What happens when it does? Does it take a political stance when it represents war? But now we're also asking, when stage dance does take a position on war, how far does it go in interrogating its own apparatus in accordance with this position? How far does it go in problematizing white harmony? In what way does it take a stance on the politics of the representability of war? Given that these wars are taking place on the soil that is foreign to the countries that dances are represented in, how does the work seek out a position within the here and elsewhere? A rare choreography in the Western stage dance that programmatically states the theme of war in its very title, Rainer's War, in capitals, is my first case to investigate. I don't know how visible it is. This is a document of the program note of war. It was created in 1970, at a time when Judson choreographers attempted to contribute to the anti-war movement, which was reaching its peak. I'm thinking here of Rainer's own M-Walk, which mobilized the New York dance and art community in a movement appropriated from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Perhaps you remember the walking step of workers dragging their bodies as slaves of capitalist machinery. And it was used to shape a protest march on the sidewalk in Soho in an aesthetic manner. In fact, such appropriation was a frequent strategy in the dance actions of the time, because it allowed them to take over the meaning that had been articulated more explicitly in media other than dance. Rainer's War occupies a peculiar place in her oeuvre, as the work was only performed as a side event to the improvisation of the Grand Union, and it went largely unnoticed by critics, while Rainer herself never even saw it in performance. However, its various materials, the score and the notes, texts, photographs, and drawings, were meticulously collected and archived in the Getty. Along with these materials, the most compelling source for this analysis has been the testimony of Pat Catterson, the only performer of the piece, who is still an active collaborator of Rainer's. Rainer's own statements on the piece haven't been quite as illuminating, in part because Rainer was more reluctant to speak about it, for reasons I'll mention in a moment. In her words, war was a huge, sprawling, non-competitive, game-like piece for 31 people, an ass-backwards war, with people willingly relinquishing the flags and opting for capture and death. Physical metaphors for war without motivation, end of quote. The demographic composition of its 31 performers is revealing. It was a group comprising mostly artists and filmmakers and only a few dancers, all of whom took Rainer's improvisation class in her loft. Most of them were white middle-class artists who were able to avoid the draft due to their student or marital status. Although they were all against the war, they didn't quite know what they were getting into. According to Catterson, they were simply, quote, people interested in having physical experience, end of quote. It seemed that they were working on similar material as in class, that is, games involving group improvisation. Rainer may not have even told them it was going to be about war while they first started working on it, or at any rate, Catterson wasn't sure whether she did. Quote, I think she said she was going to use language from war maneuvers, to create movement that would come out of this language, end of quote. There were no deliberate discussions of the topic of war in the creation process, but in all likelihood, No discussion would have seemed necessary. As Catterson said, quote, "It was just a given that everybody there was against the war," end of quote. Rayner's sources for the military maneuvers are classical, the Iliad and the Peloponnesian War, and she has never referred to any literature beyond that. The references to war in the score are deliberately generic. Lists of military terms such as encirclement and accelerated pacification, and verbs with aggressive cast, such as kill and split, search and destroy. That's also from the archive of the creation of the piece. In addition, texts relating to the war were read aloud during the performance in a steady tempo, each one every minute, while the performers were busy executing the choreography. It's important to add that the performers weren't told prior to the performance that these excerpts would be read. They included fragments of sentences that related to war, placed in an arbitrary sequence, led a punitive raid, together they would share the spoils of victory, they were cut to pieces on October 25th, and so on. And finally, 2 longer paragraphs conveyed journalistic reporting on the US operations in Vietnam in a matter-of-fact style. Only one element touched the limits of representing war in the US, the use of the American flag. The performance at Rutgers was at one point under threat of being canceled on suspicion of desecrating it, which is why Rayner introduced an artificial grass mat and an overcoat to put under the flag so it wouldn't touch the ground.
So it never touched the ground, but it was used in various ways. I think it was put on some fake grass and pulled around. I don't remember, but those were the props.
Thus, the manipulation of the American flag was the only action that could perform or cause conflict with real consequences. There was a second flag in the game as well, Jasper John's green and orange replica. The juxtaposition of the two had the effect of relativizing and neutralizing what for Catterson was the garish symbol of warmongers. This was part of what Rayner would retrospectively present as her strategy. Quote, "Well, in a war, the motivation is patriotism and believe that you have a righteous cause. There was no such backstory here," end of quote. Warfare was represented as a false contest, where one could choose to be captured, and there was no dramatic interpretation of roles, no motivation, as Rayner said. War neutralizes and relativizes both the flag and the ideological narrative of patriotic sacrifice, but it does so through a formalism that trivializes both. This is the ambiguity of her formalist strategy. It opposes war and warmongering, but only to the extent that it treats them unseriously. Like in other pieces Rayner was making then, war had an indeterminate structure, specifically that of a game. The two teams opposed each other in dance tasks in response to their leaders, who shouted commands such as infiltrate, or names of group maneuvers such as Mary Wigman Clump.
Watching with hands around shoulders was like this. Sideways T picks up flag, is carried back to group and hoisted. I think, this is a bit of a guess, but I have a vague memory that if you stood like this, it meant people could pick you up, and then you could pick up your flag, because you would try to capture the flag of the other person or retrieve your flag. Scouting. Run or walk with dodging, yes. Once around enemy territory, return to one's group. I don't know if I can run in these shoes, I'll try. I think it would be like you run like this. So you would run in a kind of zigzag way through the group, but kind of facing the same direction, through the enemy territory and then come back. So you either could choose to be captured. This makes no sense, but it was what we did. you run and flap around the group. I think you would do this with your arms. And that would mean, I desire to be captured.
One of the war maneuvers was based on ballroom dancing. It's described in this note, where a couple had a pillow between them and each had in mind a different ballroom step. Here we touch on something which isn't simply an indifferent, neutral structure, because it has a representational function. As Rainer told me, quote, "It was a conflict, right? Neither could follow the other," end of quote. Here Rainer stages conflict through a metaphor, by way of a formal mismatch. But a clumsy dance duo trying to do two different dance steps are not enemies. For Catterson, interpreting the piece retrospectively, its long duration reflected the way war felt at that time. Quote, "Our performance was just an ongoing play of these possibilities. It was just like the war. They take this city and that one. It just goes on and on. Nothing changes. Nothing gets resolved." End of quote. The flat duration of improvisational games corresponded to the protracted war. This correspondence is entirely rhetorical. I will return to formalist neutralization and rhetorical representation shortly, but first I'm going to introduce the second work by the Hungarian choreographer Esther Salomon, Monument Zero, Haunted by Wars from 1913 to 2013. The span of 100 years in its title begins with a date of multiple significance. It was the year of the premiere of The Rite of Spring on the eve of the First World War. But 1913 also marks the beginning of a long series of wars and political conflicts, from the US occupation of Haiti to the civil war in Sri Lanka, encompassing 5 continents, which are announced at the end of the piece by around 40 wooden posts. So this is a collage of the images from this piece, and this is the end scene in a slightly blurry still from the recording. Salomon included this selection on the basis of an investigation of a variety of armed conflicts, such as guerrilla and militia rebellions and violencias, as well as civil wars, liberation wars, and proxy wars, all of them precipitated by Western imperialism and colonialism and the Cold War. Hence this fragmentation and proliferation of places and dates, but also of genres of war, wars in plural and in a minor key. Although these wars took place throughout the period since 1913, there is something in Salomon's way of seeing them, emphasizing asymmetry of protracted struggles and the multiplication of dispersed conflicts, that corresponds to the consciousness of war in the post-9/11 era. With Rainer's War and Salomon's Monument Zero, we have 2 choreographies separated by 40 years, over which the understanding of war and the practice of warfare have changed. Yet both focus on wars that were created directly or indirectly by Western colonial aggression outside the territory of this so-called West. Here we can recall our leading question and try to unfold how these works address political conflict between the here and elsewhere, and how and to what extent they're able to problematize their choreographic apparatus. We've seen that Rainer's choreography neutralizes war and warmongering through its formalism on the one hand, and that it represents war in a rhetorical mode, bringing dance and combat into analogical relations on the other. How does Salomon's choreography compare? In which mode does she approach war and conflict? Monument Zero was conceived as a riposte to the Rite of Spring and its mythical theme of sacrifice for renewal. Thus, Salomon's piece questions the sacrifices demanded by Western states and by the Western dance canon since the Great War, the casualties of the wars, but also the sacrifice of the colonized other to the Western dance canon, which in her view ranges from classical ballet to the release technique. One of Salomon's claims here is that Western stage dance has marginalized movements of faces, hands, chest, and pelvis on the physical level of the body image. And I've compiled some images from the piece to demonstrate that. She therefore embarks on two axes of study. She searches for, quote, war dances and dances of resistance, the first axis, from the war zones of 5 continents where political conflicts have been perpetuated by the West, which is the second axis, end of quote. While the geographical range extends from South Africa to South Korea and from the Caribbean to Polynesia, most of the dances originate from several regions in Africa. Some of these dances are still performed with a ritual function, and others have been transfigured into social dances, in some cases as urban folklore. Unlike the dates of the wars, the names of the dances and their origin are not disclosed or credited. The reason for that, we might suspect, is in Salomon's stated intention to use only elements of dance for the purpose of choreographing, quote, expressions of war, rage, resistance, and mourning, end of quote. The dances are sourced from YouTube videos, ethnographic documentaries, and dance classes available on the internet. They also include tribal dances filmed by tourists onlookers, as well as professional dance performances for the local community. The work of appropriation is done in collaboration with the 6 dancers, 5 of whom are people of color living in the West, although only 1 dancer comes from Congo, in which some of the appropriated dances are practiced. The dancers were asked to learn the material by themselves by copying the visual sources, paying special attention to the practical and felt difficulties of embodiment. Solomon refers to this stage of appropriation as one of poetics of relation in a free interpretation of Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, whereby the dancers establish a relation to the original material by reconstructing and recomposing it. She asks, I quote, what did it entail for the performers born in Africa but living in Europe, or born in North America but of African diaspora, or just born and living in Europe, to go through the experience of the embodiment, end of quote. In the case of Rainer's War, we saw how wars and warmongering are emasculated and trivialized by game-like indetermination. By contrast, the image of war for Salomon is determinate and precious to the extent that it merits a monument of war dances celebrating an imagined alterity. At the same time, these dances provide anonymous indices to the war zones outside of the West. What are the choreographers' positions with respect to war, with respect to these concrete or more or less contemporary conflicts? To put it simply, the problem is topological. It's about where war is choreographed for us, the spectators of Rainer's War and Solomon's Monument. The wars at stake in both pieces are elsewhere and entail a relation to that elsewhere. How do these two works situate themselves between here and elsewhere? In the case of War and Monument Zero, we might ask, what is here and elsewhere? And how does the choreography operate in this and? In Rainer's War, the reference to the Vietnam War is mentioned only by some of the citations read aloud. Conflict is present in a much stronger way in their use of the American flag, whose profanation is subject to a judicial punishment. But in this case, the conflict at stake is the conflict here. Despite its implication elsewhere, Rainer's War is ultimately preoccupied with the here, not only by its provocative use of the flag, but even more so by its open-ended form, which flatters the liberal quest for democratic structures of choreography at the time. A spectator from another era wouldn't necessarily recognize the reference to the Vietnam War. Or if they did, they would be recognizing the symbols of the anti-war movement in the here, rather than the war itself. Therefore, this is a diagram here that indicates points to a bracketed elsewhere. By contrast, Monument Zero points to an elsewhere and otherwise, fragmented and multiplied in at least 29 dance scenes, whose material is constructed from twice as many tribal dances. Solomon underlines her decision, quote, to study this multiplicity that modern dance has erased as learning from the world, from the oppressed, from the unknown made other a long time ago. End of quote. The notion of learning from, quote, the unknown made other, or learning from the world, end of quote, is open to many criticisms, of course. I will first consider the problem of multiplicity aside from the cultural appropriation, which I'll come back to. Instead of choosing to relate to one other non-Western culture that has been colonized and oppressed by the Western countries, Solomon opts for a great many, an indefinite and uncertain multiplicity, which nevertheless results from selection. Rather than a multiplicity, Monument Zero used a varied selection of dances that were available in reproductive media and appealed to her choice. This varied selection is composed as if it were an infinite, that is, indefinitely extensible series. After each dance, there's always one more to follow, ever pushing forward in infinite progression. Such infinity is spurious or bad, as in Hegel's Science of Logic, because it's just an ellipsis. Within the series, the dances are organized in solos, duets, trios, quartets, quintets, and sextets, respectively, by dancers wearing dark costumes and masks with imprinted skeletons and other ornaments. Monument Zero stops after the 29th scene for a reason that has nothing to do with the content appropriated, but only with its own combinatory. It stops when all combinations have been exhausted, the dancers are exhausted, and the audience might also have had it. The narrative content of the appropriated dances, their spatial arrangement, musical accompaniment, original costumes, and most of all, their social function in the local culture and history have been removed from the movements. Everything is recomposed according to aesthetic criteria that are foreign to the material. To illustrate what this means effectively, I will show you the opening scene of Monument Zero. So in this scene, we just saw Luis Rodriguez perform a dance derived from the Balinese war dance called baris. Baris exists in ritual and non-ritual variants, and the non-ritual solo version features a young warrior. It's a kind of war grooming dance, representing the feelings of the warrior prior to the battle, like here. edited the two clips together, one imbricated into another, but that seemed to be quite a tendentious montage, so it was better to show it in a sequence. But I'm going to show you a clip which is a bit nastier now. And it's a second example that I choose because it has a slightly different modification. And it features Marfa Dance, originally known as a celebratory form of rhythmic music in Hyderabad in India, played by men usually. The dances are not only decontextualized, but reinserted in a new genre, which gives the key of the whole piece. Monument Zero is a kind of danse macabre, Totentanz. As perhaps the last dance showed it, or maybe this picture. All of the appropriated material is darkened and rendered more grotesque. But the Dance of Death has an ideological aspect that may have been relevant here, particularly in comparison with the kind of neutralization we saw in Rainer's War. This is its emphasis on equality before death. No matter one's rank in life, whether rich or poor, death unites all. Does the Dance Macabre provide a cosmological rationale for homogenizing the great many different dances? The presence of death is paradoxically placed in service of neutralization and harmony, but at the same time, the piece also draws on war dances and folkloric dances precisely with the intention of countering white harmony. So now we come to the second problematic knot, which concerns the choreographic form. War and Monument Zero are choreographies with a formalist bent. Because they represent two strands of formalism, they use appropriation and abstraction to divergent ends. Rainer's method is to appropriate military tactics and abstract them both from their context and from their form. The outcome is an open-ended game in which the form is contingent upon rules, whatever form of pedestrian movement and behavior arises from the game, thus forming a flat series of choreographic patterns. By contrast, for Solomon, the form and style of expression is all that matters. All dances are constructed with meticulous detail, precision, technical virtuosity, and pronounced rhythmicality. Movements are composed such to reverse the corporeal ideal of white harmony in analogy to how Nijinsky's Rite of Spring reversed the grammar of classical ballet. The differences between the dances in the series are just nuances, though, for what prevails is an intensified expression in loud and harsh rumbling sounds pregnant with polyrhythms. High intensity sustained throughout the whole series, which turns it into one prolonged expression of rage. Admittedly, the series is punctured a few times with more lyrical and softer episodes of crying and mourning, but overall, a sense of belligerence pervades the whole. The series is intensely flat. Observing these two formalisms, the flat and arbitrary and the flat and intense series, which ideologies do these two choreographies proffer? What images of social order are suggested by the aesthetic order of these choreographies of war? It's clear that Rainer's War yields an image of a social game that can be played with no conflict, a choreographic machine that unwinds in an endless display of possibilities. Talking to me, the choreographer remains somewhat reserved about the political meanings of what she called her politics of aesthetics. Yet Rainer seemed to defend the idea that the open form can have a political impact. She said, quote, "Games have a benign competitiveness. This was like a simulation of antagonism. There was a certain amount of competitiveness, but it wasn't antagonistic, maybe not even related to sport, because there was no winners or losers involved." The question arises as to which war Rainer's choreography was waging. Did it marry two objectives, the one of refiguring the anti-war movement against Nixon's incursion into Cambodia with her aesthetic war against representation? On which account should we judge its operations? From the point of view of an aesthetic investigation of pedestrian movement, military tactics were just another source of material for a choreographic exploration. By running war maneuvers through her techniques of rule game improvisation, Rayner added a sense of being in tune with daily politics to a modernist quest for affirming choreography whose structures no material could disturb. The aesthetic outcome of this operation is in contradiction with Rayner's politics of aesthetics. Despite its void formalism, Rayner's piece represents war as a game. And the game produces a harmonious and smooth flow of choreographic patterns in a closed circuit of self-referentiality. It promotes a sense of demotivation, indifference, and even fun, a playfulness akin to kids' play. In the case of Monument Zero, it's more difficult to elucidate a comparable image of social order. The aesthetic ideal of whiteness is repudiated, yet despite all belligerence, a sense of arrangement and whitewashing is achieved through a totalizing composition and stylistic distortion. Judged on the terms of its politics of aesthetics, Salomon's method is also contradictory. She selects material that breaks the rule of smoothness, lightness, whiteness, and harmony, and yet she uses mimesis, the method of show and copy in which ballet has established excellence and perfection. The mimetic appropriation of elements of war dances allows Salomon to construct a dancing body in the style of the grotesque death dance. The figure on stage cannot but be read as a bellicose, menacing, and monstrous, non-specified other. While it constructs dancing body in the style of while it contends with white harmony in a stylistic manner, its genesis confirms the method which is at the core of white harmony, the method that grounds the authority and hegemony of the Western dance forms, and that is mimesis and appropriation. The body produced is an aesthetic figure of alterity contrived in antithesis to the body of white harmony, and yet still structured by its aesthetic coordinates. While it conceals traces from the geocultural elsewhere, the grotesque figure of a warring dancer is born from conflict in the here, a rejection of the universalization of the Western dance canon. I feel like we are in an airplane now and I don't know how well you hear me, but if the air conditioning could be stopped for my conclusive remarks, I would appreciate it. I've been trying to answer the question, how far do these works go when they address war? Are they able to recognize the problems that war poses for their approaches? At what point do they contradict themselves? At what point do they stop short? I'm not judging their inconsistencies according to the political effects the makers hope to achieve, as the politics of aesthetics rarely has any impact outside the relatively autonomous field of arts action. Instead, I'm suggesting that we observe them on their own terms, in their aesthetic ideologies, in the contradictions they didn't manage to avoid. So to conclude, I'll summarize this in a few propositions. First, since the Second World War, wars are elsewhere for the West. The two works have shown how war is the other of Western choreography, the aesthetically repressed other of white harmony. Although these are distinct questions, war and otherness are chiastically intertwined with choreography here. Second, if war is the other of Western-based choreography, such choreography dealing with war must question its method. To jump to the discussed cases here, how could war and conflict unsettle the formalism resulting from abstraction and appropriation? Once again, how could the dancers trained in Western dance tradition learn non-Western dances other than by imitating and appropriating them? And 3, if the wars that are being addressed are elsewhere, this lends yet another reason for choreography to interrogate its operations that reaffirm the here, or what is finally staged and received in the spectacle. But the point is not to amend the faults of Rainer's and Salomon's choreographies. Rather, it's an opportunity to set a condition. In addressing war and conflict, there is an aesthetic price to pay, and that is to put one's choreography on the line, like the body engaged in conflict. The question is how much one is able or willing to risk. Thank you.